In the autumn of 1923, a German factory worker would get paid twice a day, not because he worked 2 shifts, but because by the afternoon, the money he earned in the morning had already lost a chunk of its value. Workers would rush from the pay window to the nearest store and spend everything within minutes. Waiting until evening could mean watching your wages quietly evaporate. At the peak of that crisis, prices in Germany were doubling roughly every 3.5 days. Think about what that actually means. The cost of bread, milk, a tram ticket, a newspaper. All of it, on average, twice as expensive within a long weekend. This is not a recession or a bad year. This is a currency dying in real time, and it has a name. Fast forward 85 years to Zimbabwe in 2008. The central bank there printed a single banknote with a face value of $100 trillion. 100 trillion. And at the height of the chaos, that note could not even cover a bus fare across town, a piece of paper with 12 zeros on it, not enough to get you home from work. These are not myths or exaggerations. They are documented, measured economic events recorded in the work of economists like Steve Hanke and institutions like the IMF. And they keep happening. Germany, Hungary, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, different decades, different continents, the same terrifying pattern playing out again and again. Here's the question this video answers. How does a national currency, the thing your entire life savings is denominated in, actually die? What pushes a country from normal inflation into a spiral where money becomes worthless faster than you can spend it? And why does every modern central bank treat this single outcome as the one line they can never, ever cross? Chapter 1, Weimar Germany, 1923, the most famous monetary collapse in history and the one that still haunts central bankers a full century later. To understand the scale, start with the exchange rate. Before the First World War, $1 bought a little over 4 German marks. By November of 1923, that same dollar bought about 4.2 trillion marks. The currency had not just weakened, it had been wiped out, dropping in value by a factor of roughly $1 trillion in under a decade. According to the Hanke World Hyperinflation Table, the table economists use as the gold standard for measuring these events, Weimar Germany's inflation peaked at around 29,500% per month in October 1923. That is the figure behind the price doubling every few days reality. Money was losing value so fast that printing it literally could not keep up. The human details from this period are almost surreal, but they are well documented. People burned banknotes in their stoves because the paper was cheaper than the firewood it could buy. Children built toy houses out of stacks of worthless cash. Shoppers carried money in wheelbarrows and suitcases, and there are accounts of thieves stealing the basket and leaving the money behind. How did it get there? The chain is brutally simple. Germany lost the war and owed enormous reparations. In 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, after Germany fell behind on payments. The government told workers to resist and kept paying their wages, with money it did not have, so it simply printed more. And then, remarkably, it ended almost overnight. In November 1923, Germany introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and slashed 12 zeros off the old prices. Strict limits were placed on how much new money could be created. The lesson buried in that recovery is the heart of this entire story. Hyperinflation is not a force of nature. It is a policy choice that can be reversed by another policy choice. Chapter 2, Zimbabwe 2008, the case that produced the single most extreme inflation figure ever reliably measured, a number so large most people cannot even read it aloud. During Zimbabwe's collapse, the central bank essentially stopped publishing reliable data, so economist Steve Hanke reconstructed the real numbers using market prices. His finding, published through the Cato Institute and Johns Hopkins, was staggering. At the peak in mid-November 2008, the annual inflation rate reached 89.7 sextillion%. That is an 8, a 9, and 21 more digits. On a monthly basis, that worked out to roughly 79.6 billion% in a single month. To make that human, at that rate, prices were doubling approximately every 24 hours. A loaf of bread that cost $1 in the morning could cost $2 the next day, then 4, then 8, in a relentless daily climb that no paycheck on earth could match. This is the period that produced the legendary $100 trillion note. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe kept adding zeros to the currency just to keep up, issuing larger and larger denominations, 10,000, million, billion, trillion. And still the note that said 100 trillion on its face could not reliably buy a loaf of bread or a single bus ride. The causes echo Weimar almost exactly. Years of political turmoil and a collapse in farm output gutted the economy and tax revenue. Facing a government it could not fund through taxes, the state leaned on the central bank to print money to cover the gap. Once that spiral started feeding on itself, confidence in the currency vanished entirely. How do you stop something this extreme? Zimbabwe did the only thing left. In 2009, it abandoned its own currency almost entirely and let people transact in foreign money, mainly the US dollar and the South African rand. The national money had become so worthless that the government effectively gave up on it. That is the ultimate failure state for a currency. Total abandonment. Chapter 3, Venezuela. The most recent major hyperinflation, and one of the longest-running episodes in recorded history, prove that this is not just a problem of black and white photographs and dusty history books. Venezuela holds an important place in the record. In December 2016, it became the 57th entry in the Hunkercruise World Hyperinflation Table, joining the official list of countries whose money has died. Unlike Weimar's brief, violent spike, Venezuela's crisis dragged on for years, grinding the population down month after month after month. The headline numbers depend on who measured them, and that gap is itself instructive. The International Monetary Fund projected that Venezuela's inflation would hit around 1 million% for 2018. Steve Hanke, using real-time market exchange rates, measured roughly 80,000% per year by the end of 2018. Different methods, but both screaming the same word: catastrophe. The human cost in Venezuela was severe and widely reported. Stores priced goods by weighing stacks of cash rather than counting it. Millions of people left the country in one of the largest migrations in the region's history. Basic medicine and food became scarce, and a currency that had once been stable turned into something people raced to spend the instant they received it. What makes Venezuela so important for understanding hyperinflation is the cause, because it removes a common excuse. Venezuela was not a defeated nation crushed by war reparations. It sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and yet the same fundamental mistake, covering massive government deficits by printing money, produced the same catastrophic result. Notice the pattern forming across all three cases: a Germany shattered by war, a Zimbabwe wrecked by political turmoil, a Venezuela sitting on a fortune in oil. Three completely different starting points, 3 different decades, 3 different continents. And yet the disease that struck them looks almost identical from the inside. That is the clue to what really causes this. Chapter 4. The one cause behind them all, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and it explains every case in this video. Strip away the politics, the wars, the personalities, and you are left with one mechanism. Hyperinflation happens when a government spends far more than it collects in taxes, and then funds that gap by creating new money instead of borrowing it honestly or cutting spending. The central bank becomes a money printer for the treasury, and the treasury's appetite has no limit. Here is why it spirals instead of just being bad. The government prints money to pay its bills. That extra money pushes prices up. Higher prices mean the government's spending now costs even more, so it prints even more to keep up. Prices rise again. Each turn of the wheel makes the next turn worse, a feedback loop that feeds on itself until the money's gone. There's a second faster killer hiding inside this: psychology. Once people truly believe their money will be worth less tomorrow, they stop holding it. They spend it the instant it arrives or swap it for goods, foreign currency, anything real. That rush to dump the currency accelerates the collapse, because nobody wants to be the last one holding paper that is melting in their hands. So the common thread across Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela is not bad luck or a particular ideology. It is a specific fiscal and monetary failure repeated in different costumes, a government that cannot or will not balance its books, a central bank that is not independent enough to say no, and a population that finally loses faith. Hit all three and the money dies. And this is the crucial distinction. Normal inflation, the few percent a year you hear about in the news, is a very different animal from hyperinflation. One is a tax on your savings that erodes slowly. The other is the complete destruction of money as a useful tool. The line between them is crossed not by accident, but by a government that turns the printing press into its primary source of funding. Chapter 5. Why central banks fear it? Because everything you have just seen is precisely the nightmare that modern monetary policy is built to prevent. This is why, in most developed economies, the central bank is deliberately kept independent from the politicians who control spending. The whole point of that separation is to make sure no government can simply order the money printer to run whenever it wants to pay its bills. Weimar and Zimbabwe are the textbook arguments for that wall between the treasury and the printing press. It also explains the obsession with inflation targets. When you hear a central bank talk about aiming for around 2% inflation, that number is not arbitrary. It is a commitment device, a public promise to keep money stable and predictable, precisely so the spiral we have been describing never gets the chance to begin. Credibility, once lost, is brutally hard to win back. There is a famous warning attributed to economist John Maynard Keynes, paraphrasing Lenin, that the surest way to destroy a society is to debauch its currency. Whether or not the exact wording is true, the insight is real. Hyperinflation does not just empty bank accounts, it shreds the basic trust that lets strangers trade, save, and plan for the future. And the damage goes far beyond economics. In Weimar Germany, the ruined middle class and the trauma of worthless savings helped poison the political ground that extremism later grew in. Hyperinflation is rarely just a financial event. It is a social and political earthquake that can reshape a country for a generation, long after the prices finally stabilize. So when you watch central banks move carefully, raise rates, and guard their credibility, remember what they are guarding against. Not just an uncomfortable rise in the cost of living, but the full nightmare scenario. A wheelbarrow of cash that buys nothing, a $1 trillion note worth less than the paper, and the slow-motion death of a nation's money. So let's bring it home. Hyperinflation is rare, But it is not impossible, and it is not random. It follows a clear recipe. A government that spends what it cannot raise, a central bank that prints to fill the gap, and a public that eventually loses all faith in the paper in its pocket. Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela are 3 versions of that exact same story. Understanding why this happens is the best protection against the fear and the myths that surround it. None of this is financial advice, and it's history and economics meant to help you read the headlines with a clearer eye. If this made the numbers click for you, hit follow on Market Minute for more breakdowns like this, and tell me in the comments which collapse surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next one.